Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, which is on fostering the growth mindset. I'm really looking forward to this evening's webinar, and I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment. I've now had the pleasure of attending this webinar a few times throughout the past 2 years, always different versions of it. And I have to say, every time I learn something new from it. I think whether you're a parent, a student, a tutor, or a teacher, there is definitely something to be gained from learning more about this topic. So again, I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment, but first I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Bespoke Education to give you a sense of who we are and what we do. I'm going to screen share in just a moment. We are Bespoke Education. We've been in business for over 20 years, supporting students throughout their entire academic journey. We have offices on the Upper East Side, on the Upper West Side, and in Bronxville. But in today's era of remote learning, we're able to support students throughout the world. So what do we do? Well, first of all, we do tutoring. For about 20 years, we've been refining our understanding of what makes good tutoring. Specifically, how can we best support our tutors and how can we best support our students? We're able to meet with students both online and in person, students starting in kindergarten all the way up to graduate students. We also do a lot of college admissions work with students, where students work with our college admissions counselors on their applications, selecting their college lists, and even strategizing that. We also offer academic coaching, which is a subscription-based model where students are paired with an academic coach who works with them on executive function skills and organization, as well as homework support. You can find more information on that on our website. And we also have a new program called Bespoke Changemakers, which we're very excited about. Through this program, students work with entrepreneurs and business leaders to develop projects that promote social impact, equity, and equality in their communities. You can also find more information on that on our website. And we've been hosting these free webinars for about 2 years now. On our website, you will find more information about these webinars. You'll be able to view all the topics that we've offered in the past, and you can even view recordings of them. If you subscribe to our mailing list, you'll be able to receive updates about future webinars. We also do a lot of mock testing. We're industry leaders in this field. Students do not have to be tutoring with a bespoke tutor in order to take a mock test with us, but it's a very important component of the test prep process. It's kind of like a dress rehearsal for a play. It enables students the opportunity to simulate real test day conditions so that they're really confident and prepared for test day. A very important facet of our company is bespoke access. It's through our partnerships with private schools, public schools, and charter schools that we're able to offer free and low-cost tutoring and test prep classes to deserving students, most of whom are on financial aid at their schools. You can also find more information about what we're doing in this realm on our website. And finally, we know test prep. Whether it's SAT, ACT, the high school admissions entrance tests, the full suite of graduate exams, Hunter test, ERBs, AP exams, Regents. We have tutors who know these tests. We have administrators who have lots of experience talking about these tests and guiding families and students through them. Interestingly enough, one of our panelists for this evening, Ariel Bernstein, is a graduate school test prep expert, graduate school admissions expert. I'm going to introduce him in just a moment. And I'm looking forward to hearing what we have to say. And finally, please be sure to contact us. We'll be leaving our contact information in the chat. You can either give us a call or you can fill out our contact form online and someone will be in touch with you. These initial calls are free of charge. We really look forward to having them. We love being able to share as much information and wisdom that we can with families. So if you have a question about anything that you'll learn today or anything that may come up in your child's academic journey, please get in touch with us. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists for this evening. Dan Cousins is Bespoke's Chief Operating Officer and Head of Tutoring, and Ariel Bernstein wears a lot of hats, but at Bespoke and for all intents and purposes of this webinar, he is a grad school test prep expert, and a grad school admissions expert. So Dan and Ariel, could you tell us a bit about your background and what you're working on these days?
Of course. Thank you, Sarah. It's great to see you. And Ariel, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Dan, as Sarah said. I've been here at Bespoke Education for a long time, since 2006. I've played many roles here. I've been a tutor for many different subjects, and I've been on the administrative team for about 6 years now. And even in that role, I've seen some evolution. Right now, what I'm working on is what I call tutoring the tutors. I recruit, hire, and train the tutors, not just as they join the company, but as they continue their careers here. I make sure that they know what makes great tutoring, how they can do it with their students, in their classes, and just to ensure that they are getting the benefit of the wisdom and the practice that we've been accumulating over the last 20 years of doing this here in New York City. So I'm really excited to share some of that with you all today.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's really great to have you. And Ariel, could you introduce yourself as well?
I'd be happy to. Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel Bernstein. Sarah is correct. I wear many hats. The most relevant hat I wear is I've been at Bespoke for about 4.5 years now. And I am one of the tutors that Dan tutors, but I'm fairly unique as Bespoke tutors go. I work almost exclusively with students applying to graduate school. So it often starts as support with the GRE or the GMAT, often extends to other aspects of the application, like personal statement support, letters of recommendation support, maybe even mock interview support. So that's what I do at Bespoke. I also work full-time at the NBA, the National Basketball Association, and there I do executive coaching and leadership development. And I do a lot of things there, but what I always say is that my mission is that to help leaders, to help managers be a little bit more strategic, a little bit more intentional with how they show up with their teams. Thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those introductions. I'm going to hand it over to Dan and Ariel in just a moment, but first I just wanted to cover a few logistical items for this evening's webinar. The first is we are about to launch a poll somewhere on your screen. If you could please answer that, it really does help us direct our messaging towards who's in attendance this evening. Second, did want to let everyone know that the chat and the Q&A are both available if you have any questions that pop up throughout the course of this webinar. We would love it if everyone could post in the Q&A, because that way it does enable other participants to see your question and we can make this more of a live discussion. You can post anonymously if you'd wish. This webinar will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about writing down notes, stopping your screen. Don't have to worry about missing anything, because everyone will receive a recording of this webinar. And finally, we are a word of mouth company. So if you like what you hear today, or if you have any colleagues or friends, family members who may find this interesting, please feel free to share this recording with them. And also give us a call if you have any questions afterwards. Again, we're always happy to take your calls. And Dan and Ariel, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I just want to say a couple of words about the origin of this webinar, and then also about the shape of what's going to happen tonight. First of all, as I said, I do a lot of tutoring the tutors and tutor training. And one piece of that I'm really proud of is our professional development seminar series, which are internal trainings on topics that I call tangential to tutoring. So not how to tutor the SAT or how to consult on a student's college essay, but things like mindfulness and meditation in tutoring. We had a training with a PhD student who's also a tutor here on memory, because a student is a neuroscientist in training. And so she had a lot to tell us on how memory works and how we can use it with our students. And today's seminar grew out of that program. We worked with Ariel first, I think in 2018, and again in 2020 for a training for the tutors. And lately we've been doing more of these inside out trainings, bringing you all in, showing some of the clients what we're doing in our internal training. And that's what we're doing today. We're taking a training that our tutors have received, a piece of our tutoring conversation, and we're bringing it to you all. So we retooled it. I'm really excited to share it. What we've got today is a presentation and remarks by Ariel. Then we're going to have a conversation, some questions that I've got. I'm sure some new questions will come up because, as Sarah said, every time we see this, there's some new stuff to think about. And then, of course, opportunity for questions from you all. So if you've got something, a question or something you're curious about, please put it in the Q&A or the chat right away, and I'll find a way to incorporate it as we go on. So Ariel, before you begin your remarks, do you have anything you'd like to say just to kind of kick us off?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think it's helpful to give a similar origin story as to how I kind of came to this work myself. So before I joined Bespoke, before I joined the MBA, I spent many years, arguably too many years, in graduate school studying psychology. I earned my master's degree in counseling psychology at NYU and ultimately pursued a PhD in organizational psychology at Columbia. And the reason why I bring that up is because it was in graduate school that I learned about what a fixed mindset was, and I learned about what a growth mindset is. And it was there that I recognized kind of the power of these mindsets, both in an educational context and outside. And what was exciting for me was that when I learned what they were and their implications, I saw immediately their relevance to tutoring. So it's always an exciting time to kind of connect my two worlds of psychology and tutoring. So I'm excited to share with you what mindsets are and why I think you should care about them. So I'm going to share my screen. And so tonight is all about fostering a growth mindset and really key to academic success. 3 goals for our conversation tonight. Number 1, identify the implications of both fixed and growth mindsets. We'll talk about what they are and why they matter. And I'm curious to know how much you might know about fixed and growth mindsets. But my hope is that by the end of the evening, you know not just what they are, but why they're important. Importantly, we'll talk about next, how do we recognize our mindsets? Once we establish that they're important and that we should pay attention to them, we'll talk about, well, how can we see them in action? And then lastly, we'll talk about how can we cultivate a growth mindset? And again, don't worry about it if you don't know exactly what these terms mean. We'll dive in short order. But before we kind of get too deep into it, I actually want to start with a hypothetical for you all, which is, when do you feel smart? Is it when you find something really easy, or is it moments in which you're learning? Right? Is it moments in which something is really easy in the sense of, I just did something and I did it flawlessly. I didn't make any mistakes. Right? Something was really easy for me and maybe it wasn't easy for other people. Is it those moments? Or do we feel smart when something is really hard, and as a result, we try really hard at it, but at the end of the day, we able to tackle something, learn something that we didn't know before? Let me give you a second to think about that. I ask because where you kind of land on this question, your response to this question might give you a window into whether you might have a fixed or growth mindset. So what are fixed and growth mindsets? So a fixed mindset is the idea that when it comes to our skills, when it comes to our abilities, those with a fixed mindset believe that those skills are carved in stone. Whatever intelligence you have today, well, that's the same amount of intelligence you're going to have tomorrow, right? Whatever math ability we have today, that's the same math ability we're going to have tomorrow, right? You either have it or you don't. Well, importantly, if you hold a fixed mindset around intelligence or math ability or any other attribute, well, that's going to shape your interpretation of events. It's going to shape the decisions you make. So for example, if you have a fixed mindset and you believe that your quality is carved in stone, well, you're going to be hyper-focused on proving that you have that attribute in spades, right? So if you have a fixed mindset around math, you might say to yourself, well, this next math test, this is going to reveal that either I'm smart or I'm not, right? It's this idea that any test, any sort of evaluation could measure us or define us forever. People with a growth mindset, in contrast, believe that qualities are not carved in stone, but rather qualities can be cultivated. They can be cultivated through effort and through practice and trial and error. People with a growth mindset believe that our potential is unknown, it's limitless. And in fact, it's unknowable. There's kind of no limit to our possibilities. So that's what fixed and growth mindsets are kind of at a high level. How are they measured? So fixed and growth mindsets are well established in the literature, in their research. They were first, the term was first coined by a psychologist named Carol Dweck. She's a professor currently at Stanford and previously at Columbia. And what's powerful about them, about mindsets, is that they have been studied from everyone as early as 4 years old. They brought 4-year-olds into a lab and they measure their mindsets and the impact of those mindsets, all the way up to corporate America. So just last year, Microsoft wrote a white paper around how a growth mindset has helped shape their culture and how they're trying to instill a growth mindset culture to help grow their business. So how are they measured? So they're measured by asking people a set of questions and asking them, to what extent do you agree with statements such as, your intelligence is something very basic about you that you cannot change very much, right? If you were to agree with this statement, they would say that you're more likely to have a fixed mindset. Similarly, if you were to agree with this statement, you can learn new things, but you cannot really change how intelligent you are. Again, agreeing with this statement would likely land you adhering to a fixed mindset. A couple of things that just to kind of level set. Mindsets are not a binary dimension, but rather a spectrum, right? So you might be sometimes having a fixed mindset and sometimes having a growth mindset, right? We typically have a default setting, but depending upon the situation and context, we might shift in one direction or another. Importantly, just because you have a fixed mindset in one dimension doesn't mean you're going to have it in another. So for example, you might believe that math ability is a fixed quality, right? Whatever we have today is going to be what we have tomorrow. Whereas you might think aspects like aspects of our personality aren't fixed, but rather can be grown. And there's actually research that shows that shyness, for example, different personality qualities like shyness, some people have a fixed mindset around that. Some people have a growth mindset around that. So just because you are oriented towards one or the other in one particular attribute doesn't mean that you're going to be inclined towards that belief for all attributes. Okay, so now that we've talked about what they are and how they've kind of been studied, let's talk about why they matter. So at its core, where people with a fixed and growth mindset differ is around their belief of skills. So people with a fixed mindset believe our skills are innate, right? You're born with it, you either have it or you don't. Whereas people with a growth mindset believe that skills can be cultivated, again, through practice and effort and intentionality. Well, when you start with this as a building block, you can see very quickly how this mindset impacts how you interpret events and what decisions you make. So very important in an educational context, your mindset impacts how you perceive challenges. So those with a fixed mindset are really scared of challenge because challenge to them might reveal a lack of skill, right? When we challenge ourselves, when we try to stretch ourselves, well, more often than not, when we take our first steps, we're probably going to fall, right? We're going to not hit a home run the first time out. Well, that's a painful experience for those with a fixed mindset because they interpret that challenge as failure, right? This idea that, oh, I struggled. Well, that's a reminder that I've hit my outermost limit. I've hit my potential. And as a result, they don't pursue challenges as much, right? Because challenge for them, failure for them, it's a very scary idea. It's a very painful concept. So rather than enduring that pain, they choose a different path entirely. Whereas people with a growth mindset say there's challenges are not failure. There's no such thing as failure. It's just an opportunity to learn, right? So they might say, yeah, that doing poorly on this test was painful, but they quickly pivot and say, well, how can I learn from this? How can I take on a new, how can I kind of learn from this? How can I take on a new approach? Similarly, those with a fixed and growth mindset differ in their interpretation of effort. So those with a fixed mindset believe talent and effort are mutually exclusive. I'm going to repeat that. Those with a fixed mindset believe talent and effort are mutually exclusive, right? Because theoretically, if you have to try at something, if you have to exert effort, well, that means you're not naturally good at it, right? So it might be a painful reminder for you to have to try. I work with students all the time. I used to teach psychology at Barnard for 4 years, and I saw this all the time with my students. There was a level of cachet or currency of not having to study, right? As if to say, I'm just naturally talented, I'm just naturally gifted, I don't need to, right? It was kind of a badge of honor when you don't have to try. That could be an indication of having a fixed mindset. Whereas people with a growth mindset say, effort is how you become good at something, right? You can't, no one's good at something the first time out. You get better, you become a master of something through effort and through practice and through self-reflection. And similarly, very different kind of orientation around this idea of feedback, right? So for people with a fixed mindset, if they get feedback, specifically constructive feedback, they read that as painful criticism. The idea that it's a reminder that they're not as good as they would like to be, that they're not as smart as they'd like to be. They've actually done fMRI research, studies of the brain, that found that those with a fixed mindset are only interested in feedback that addressed whether or not a question was right or wrong, right? They're not focused on, their brain is not active when they're talking about why was this question right or wrong, right? They're not focused on the process, they're only focused on the outcome. Conversely, those with a growth mindset believe that feedback is how you get better, right? Feedback increases our self-awareness, increases our kind of understanding of what our gaps are and how to course correct. So let's talk about how this looks in a hypothetical situation. So let's say a student receives a poor grade on an exam, right? Happens all the time. Let's talk through how someone's mindset might have implications psychologically, behaviorally, and ultimately academically. So let's say we have someone who has a fixed mindset around her intelligence. How is she going to interpret a poor grade on an exam? Well, she might say to herself, I'm bad at this. This is not my thing, right? She might say this out loud to other people. She might say it to herself as kind of it's an inner monologue, right? That poor grade is a reminder to her that this is not her thing. How is she going to respond behaviorally? It's probably going to lead to decreased effort, right? Because if you are not good at something, you don't have tangible success, and you believe you're not going to get better at it, well, you're probably going to try less hard, right? It's just rationally, it's not worth my energy, it's not worth my time. But also emotionally, it's painful to try at something if you don't believe you're going to get better at it, right? It's going to be a painful reminder that you're not good at it. So I'm going to go pursue something else instead. Well, when we exert less energy and attention, what happens? Not surprisingly, we see diminished engagement, diminished performance. Ironically and unfortunately, that ultimately reinforces the fixed mindset, right? If we believe our intelligence is fixed, which ultimately leads to decreased engagement and performance, it reinforces the idea that we don't have it, that our qualities are carved in stone. Now, contrast that up against someone who believes her intelligence can grow. Now, I'm not suggesting that she's going to be thrilled that she performed poorly on the exam, right? Those with a growth mindset care just as much about the outcomes and having success as do those with a fixed mindset. But how they respond in kind is very different. They pivot and they interpret very differently. So how is someone with a growth mindset likely to respond to receiving a poor grade on an exam? They might say to themselves, okay, this is helpful information. I haven't mastered this yet, right? This score is a data point that I haven't yet mastered this. I need to pivot. I need to try something new. Next time I'm going to work harder, or I'm going to work smarter. I'm going to try a new approach. What is that going to engender? It's going to engender increased effort, not decreased, and adaptive learning strategies. Okay, if X didn't work, let me try Y. In turn, that's going to lead to increased engagement, increased performance, right? We're opening ourselves up to new possibilities, which again, ironically, is only going to reinforce that growth mindset, that through trial, and effort, and practice, we can get better. So how do we spot mindsets? How do we see them, notice them in the wild? Because what's important is that if we can be aware of our mindsets, if we can be aware of our loved ones' mindsets, we can ultimately do something about it. And for me, kind of what undergirds all of this is the idea that how we think impacts how we feel. And how we feel ultimately impacts how we behave. So if we can really be in touch and aware of how we think and kind of what our inner talk track is, we have a huge ability to change how we behave. So how do we spot it? We notice what we're saying and what we're not saying. So let's start with what we might hear both said out loud or said to ourselves with a growth mindset. So those are the growth mindset say, I'd like to try new things. Right? People that they study this even with 4-year-olds. They brought 4-year-olds into a lab and they kind of measured their mindsets, and they gave them puzzles. And after they solved the puzzle, they asked them, do you want to do the same? Do you want to do the exact same puzzle? Or do you want to try something new? And the 4-year-olds with the growth mindset kind of looked at them, kind of confused, and like, why would I want to try the same thing? Like, I want to try new things, right? That's something that someone with a growth mindset would say, not necessarily someone with a fixed mindset. Similarly, you might hear from someone with a growth mindset, challenges help me to grow, right? We pursue challenge, we seek it out. Even if we're going to fall on our face at first, that's okay, because that's what learning looks like. But conversely, someone with a fixed mindset, I hear this all the time from students, is I'm either good at this or I'm not. I worked with a student recently. She was really anxious about kind of getting back on the standardized test course, if you will. And she had been out of college for a couple of years. She's now pursuing graduate school. She hasn't studied for a standardized test in a while. And she said, oh, I hate standardized tests. Well, it's a powerful statement. And it might conjure up a fixed mindset, right? Because when you tell yourself, I hate standardized tests, I'm not good at math, well, you've kind of made up your mind, right? You've kind of closed the door to any sort of opportunity to improve in that area. And you've kind of let yourself off the hook, right? If you say, I'm not good at math, you've kind of implicitly told yourself, I don't need to try. In fact, I shouldn't try, right? If I'm not good at math, I'm not going to waste my time by trying, right? Because trying might be a painful reminder that I'm not as good at this as I would like, right? So I say all this to say, the more we can be in touch with what we're saying, what we're hearing, the more we can be able to kind of spot mindsets in the moment. What's exciting, though, is that growth mindsets can be developed. I'm gonna go meta for a second and say it's good to have a growth mindset about mindsets. Why do I say this? I say this because there's research that shows that mindsets can be developed. They actually brought people into a lab and they kind of sampled, they looked at people with a fixed mindset. And they asked themselves, well, can we try to change people's mindsets? Can we kind of provide an intervention that will shift people's default setting? So they did some education. They started teaching them about what mindsets are and kind of that we have a choice as to what our mindsets are. And they told them learning creates stronger connections in the brain, right? When we learn, we get smarter. When we learn, our brain gets stronger. And what's a part of learning? Well, part of learning is recognizing that it's a non-linear process, that it's sloppy and messy, and learning requires us to get things wrong, right? Because when we get things wrong and we're focused on moving forward, we often ask, well, why? Why did I get it wrong? How did that happen? And how can I make sure it doesn't happen again? Right? Learning allows us to connect, or to make stronger connections in the brain. And what's incredible is that after they kind of injected this mindset into these participants, they actually tracked their academic success outside of the laboratory. They said, okay, go back to school. And they saw how they performed. And what's incredible is that those with whom they injected a growth mindset saw better grades. Their GPAs went up. Whereas those with a fixed mindset and who were in the control group, who were not told learning creates stronger connections in the brain, they saw their grades dip. So fixed growth mindset, incredibly powerful, but what's exciting is that they can be developed. So where does that leave us? Leaves us with, well, how do we, now that we've established that they can be developed, let's talk about how they can be developed. So I want to start with 5 tips that we see here on the screen. The first is to educate, and it goes back to what we were just talking about. Know that our mindsets can be changed, right? Just because we have a particular mindset today doesn't mean we're going to have that mindset tomorrow. So the first piece is educate. Our brain is like a muscle. It grows when we use it, right? If we can really believe, really kind of adhere to this idea that learning makes stronger connections in the brain, it's the first step towards inducing a growth mindset. Similarly, it's really important to hear your own mindset voice, right? We all have default settings. It's good to know what ours are, because if we know what they are, we can then have a choice as to what we do about it. It's also good to know what are our triggers, right? What are the situations, what are the context, what are the topics, what are the people around us who are likely to kind of induce that mindset. Third, encourage struggling. And I do this all the time with my students. Remember that learning is messy. Learning is sometimes painful, but that's how we get better. I just had a tutoring session last night, and we were working on a problem, and she was really frustrated when she got the problem wrong. And I said, hey, like, we know we learn more from our mistakes than from our successes, right? When we get a question right, we just kind of take for granted that we know exactly how to get it right, and we move on to the next question and are slower to ask, well, why did I get it right? Or how could I have gotten it right more quickly, right? But when we get something wrong, it kind of stops us in our tracks, and it allows us to ask, well, why? How can I get better next time? I always say that the phrase is, it's like riding a bike. The phrase is not, it's like learning how to ride a bike, right? Because learning how to ride a bike is not fun. We fall, we bruise ourselves, we bleed, sometimes we cry. It's not a pleasant experience. That's what learning often feels like. But we know that it's necessary, it's crucial. So encourage struggling, lean into the struggle, because that ultimately is what learning looks like. Fourth, and maybe the most controversial thing I'll say tonight, praise effort, not ability. We have a tendency to offer well-intended, well-meaning labels, statements to our loved ones. But what the research suggests is that it can be really detrimental, can backfire, right? So telling someone they're talented, or they're brilliant, or they're gifted, or even that they're smart, all well-intended, all nice to hear in the moment, but what the research shows that it can be really detrimental, right? Because if I believe that I'm gifted, okay, well, now I'm feeling a sort of pressure to live up to that gifted reputation. So what happens when I struggle? What happens when I don't do well on that math test? That might be evidence that I'm not gifted. Okay, well, that might mean that I don't challenge myself. I don't try new things, right? Or when I do struggle, it's particularly painful. So while it's nice to say and certainly nice to hear that we're talented, brilliant, or gifted, or even smart, I encourage you to think what might be the unintended consequences of that. Conversely, the research shows that it's much better, much more helpful to praise the process, praise the effort, right? So someone did really well in an exam, don't say, oh, well, you nailed it, you're so smart, you're really good at this, right? Well intended. Rather than saying all those things, say something that conjures up kind of their effort, their process. Right? You did really well in this. You must have studied really hard. Oh, you did really well in this. I know how much this means to you. I know how much effort you put into this. Your effort really shows in your score, right? Praise effort, not ability. And lastly, the power of yet. It's this idea that simply adding the word yet to our messages, to our thought processes, leaves open the possibility for next, for more, right? So I challenge my students on this all the time. I had a student just last week who said, I'm not good at math. I immediately said, you're not good at math yet, right? Subtle but significant, subtle but powerful, because it's the idea that no one's a finished product, right? No one is a closed book. No one's a finished product. By just adding a simple yet to our sentences, it leaves open the room for possibilities, the room for more. They've actually started to bring this into educational spaces. They've actually, in many schools, have done away with the letter grade F. F is such a stamp of rejection, right? Failure, you failed. A lot of schools have changed Fs to not yets. This idea that, okay, you haven't yet mastered this concept, you haven't yet passed this concept, yet you will. You just need to have another chance at it. So I'm going to pause there. Hopefully that will give you some food for thought, Dan. I'm going to stop my share.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was excellent, though now I'm realizing that I can't say that. And in fact, I should say, I see how hard you worked to deliver a dynamic and enjoyable presentation. So thank you, Ariel.
I appreciate that. It's funny, I was actually finding myself struggling with a fixed and growth mindset myself in preparing this presentation. So I was saying to myself, oh, it's important that I come across as the expert on these things. So I should be flawless. I should make this look easy, right? Even suppose it's the person who knows a lot about this topic, I often fall into tricky bad habits if I'm not careful.
It's always there, and I think that's some of what we'll get around to today, hopefully, in this conversation. My first question for you, coming out and hearing what you had to say today, has to do with your tutoring work and your work with students specifically. And I'm curious what you're looking for. What are you listening for when you meet a student for the first time, when you talk to a parent and hear them tell about their student in those first couple of sessions? What are you looking for that gives you an indication or a hint about your student's mindset and how that might impact your work together?
Yeah, I'm on the lookout for it even before I start my work with my student. So before I sit down and actually roll up our sleeves and get into the work, I always have an introductory call with my students, just for them to get to know a little bit about me, my background, and my approach to the tutoring work. It's also very helpful for me to get to know them and their familiarity either with the tests we're talking about or the concepts embedded. I'm always curious to know what's their experience, either positive or negative, with tutoring. I'm also trying to kind of suss out in the background what mindset might they be walking around with, right? So if I hear global assessments, global evaluation of their skills, something like I hate standardized tests, or I'm not good at math, or math isn't my thing, right? I hear that all the time. That might suggest to me that they're walking around with a fixed mindset. And I will actually bring this up. I will actually introduce the concepts of mindsets in this introductory call. I ask them, are they aware of it? And if not, I kind of give a high level overview of what it is and why it's relevant. And I do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I find that a lot of students aren't aware of what mindsets are, and it can be a weight off their shoulders when they learn that what they are and how their mindsets can change. I work with a lot of students who are really high achieving and put a lot of pressure on themselves. And I think they walk around with a fixed mindset, and it's a big weight on their shoulders, right? I mentioned before, I used to teach at Barnard. I used to teach psychology there for 4 years, and I would start every single semester with a lecture on fixed and growth mindsets. And at the end of the year, I would always ask for feedback. Hey, which lectures were most, looking back, which lectures were most interesting, most helpful to you all? And every single semester, the lecture on fixed and growth mindsets always came to the front, always came to the top, right? It was, even though it was the first lecture of the semester, it was always the one that was most remembered. Because I think people see the impact of the mindsets. But the reason why I bring that up is just because I mention it to my students in our introductory call so that they understand, A, this is kind of how I approach the work and how I see the tutoring relationship. But also, if mindsets become relevant later on when we're actually in the work, in the tutoring partnership, I actually then, because I've already brought it up in our introductory call, I feel a lot more comfortable bringing it up in the moment when it's kind of alive and well in our tutoring conversation. Whereas if I were to kind of bring it up out of left field for the first time in the moment, it might feel like a personal critique or criticism. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want that. So I say all that to say I'm constantly thinking about where my students' mindset is and how it can kind of impact our relationship.
That makes very good sense. Thank you. How about the process versus a product question? Because we work on test prep frequently, and your work on the GRE or GMAT, or with many of our students on the SAT and ACT, there is no doubt that we are trying to generate a product. We're trying to improve the score, trying to get a better grade, trying to help a student pass the class. All of those things are quantified. But so much of actual improvement comes down to a better process, better habits, better approaches to the work. So how do you see that play out when you're working with your students on practice tests, on the GRE, on the GMAT?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me just say, before I answer that question, what it reminds me of is as growth mindsets have become, they've taken off both in educational contexts and even in workplace contexts, just like many other things, they've been kind of misunderstood. And there's actually kind of some myths around what a growth mindset is. So let me just say that I want to dispel the myth that people with a growth mindset don't care about the outcome, right? There's this idea that people with a growth mindset, oh, as long as you're learning, it's all that matters. That's not the case. That is a myth, right? Because people with a growth mindset care just as much about the outcome. They care just as much that their efforts are worth their time. It's that they recognize that the learning is part of the process, right? If you're not learning throughout, you're likely going to have worse outcomes. Right. So what Carol Dweck and those who've researched this would say is that, of course, success matters, but we get in trouble when our focus on achievement crowds out our focus on learning. And I really pride myself in holding that mentality with my students. I often analogize my role as a fitness instructor for standardized tests. Right? What you go to the gym, what does a fitness instructor focus on? They focus on form more than anything else, right? Focus on good form when the weights are light and when they're heavy, right? Because the idea that if you have good form when their weights are light, you can then have good form when the weights are heavy, right? So what I focus on with my students is not just did you get to the right answer, but did you get to the right answer quickly? Did you get to the right answer efficiently? So in my mind, good process ultimately begets good outcomes.
It's really enlightening. It reminds me of a student, I mean, one in particular, but I'm thinking of many students who fall into this category who are just so focused on getting the right answer. We do a lot of practice tests in our work on the standardized tests, and then in a tutoring session, we talk about the practice test and talk about the mistakes they made. And one of the things we also talk about is the things that they got right. And for me as a tutor, that's a really valuable tool because I can look at the work that they did on a question that they got right, and I can see that they got it in a way that is not the best way to have gotten it. Or maybe I can see from that work that it took them 5 minutes to solve that problem, and that's no good because they're wasting time. And I'll ask them to revisit that problem. And this one student in particular would always say, "Why? I got it right. We don't need to talk about it." And I would say to her, that actually doesn't matter. Getting this problem right doesn't matter at all. What we're here to work on is making sure that when you're in there on the test on your own, you have as many tools as possible to get as many questions right as possible. So we would revisit questions once, twice, 3 different ways, if there are 3 different ways of solving that problem, to help her understand it's not necessarily about just getting it right, but it's about expanding the ways in which you can get it right.
I love that.
I'm curious about long-term implications of growth mindsets, whether that's something you've seen with your students in your work together or in the rest of your career. I'm just curious how these can play out not only in the academic sphere, but elsewhere.
Yeah. So what comes to mind is both medium term and long term. I think in the medium term, and the research backs this up, if you really kind of adhere to a fixed mindset, it's going to worsen your academic performance, right? Because you're going to interpret challenge, you're going to interpret struggle, you're going to interpret effort very differently, and as a result, you're not going to kind of lean in to effort. You're not going to lean into challenge. It's also going to undermine your self-esteem, right? Because if we don't feel like we have self-efficacy around these topics, right? Self-efficacy, the idea that I believe that I can be good at this, I believe I have the power to be good at this, it's going to undermine our well-being. That's kind of the medium term. The long term, kind of the downstream consequences of that is it impacts our career choices, right? If I worked with a student recently who she was really scared of the LSAT, so she didn't take the LSAT. She was going to go to law school, and she said, "You know what? LSAT looks like a beast. I don't think I can hack these types of questions. I'm going to go do something else entirely." Powerful choice. It's a life-changing choice, right? If you have a growth mindset, it leaves you open to the possibility of pursuing any career, any path that appeals to you, irrespective of what that journey looks like. Even after career choices, though, there's research that shows that our mindsets impact our parenting style, right? Where our mindset is going to impact how we respond to our children and what paths we kind of point them toward. So the consequences, the impact of all this can be felt in both in the short term and in the long term.
Thank you. I'm thinking about the role of the educator, and in so many ways the tutor or the teacher can act as a model for the student or for the students in their classes, and a lot of it is on the educator to create a safe space for a student to make mistakes, to feel like it's okay to look dumb. It's okay to make a really boneheaded mistake because you tried. So I'm curious what you do in your tutoring to make that kind of safe space, to make it more okay for a student to make a mistake, for a student to risk something.
Yeah, I'm pausing because I'm debating with myself whether there's anything more important than creating safe space for students. I'm not sure there is. I say that because it's a very tutoring and signing up for tutoring is a very vulnerable endeavor. I recognize I'm rarely seeing my students at their best, right? Because kind of inherent to the process is students come to me, they come to Bespoke when they say, you know what, I tried studying on my own, it's just not working out. Or I don't think I can do this on my own, right? So they're kind of acknowledging vulnerability at the onset. So I try my very best to encourage that mindset, encourage that behavior, welcome it, right? Because the last thing I would want to do is judge them, make them feel dumb, right? So to your point, I go out of my way to say no question is dumb, right? There's no such thing as a dumb question. There's no such thing as a dumb mistake, right? Because keep in mind, I work with students applying to graduate school. For many of them, they're turning their attention to the GRE. They thought they were done with standardized tests. They've been going through college. Maybe they've been working for a few years. They're like, wasn't expecting to have to study math again. So they feel really rusty. And sometimes that rust comes across as embarrassment or shame. I try to kind of dissuade them from that mentality. They often say, oh, I should remember this. I'm very careful of noting words like should or have to. We call them out and say, there's no such thing as should. It's just like, this is where we are. This is why we're here. I remind them that, hey, we learn more from our mistakes than our successes. I touched on that earlier. Very importantly, when I make a mistake, I own it, right? Like, I think it's very easy when you are the expert in the room and you make a mistake. It can be very tempting to kind of try to hide behind it, try to hide it, right? Because experts don't make mistakes. Well, if you see your role as a tutor to be flawless, what signal do you think that sends to your students, right? So when I do make a mistake, I own it. Because when I make a mistake, when the expert makes a mistake, what makes it safe for them to make mistakes as well?
It's totally true.
Yeah.
The value of modeling, I think, can't be understated. For the tutor to model the approach, the humility, the ability to make mistakes, for teachers to do the same thing, for parents as well, on that note. And I think about that all the time. I'm a fairly new parent myself, so it's constantly on my mind. Something that's really interesting here is that the attitude is so important, even on a technical practice like improvement at a standardized test. And the attitude is something that the students really don't get on their own, because all they hear about the standardized test is it's a big challenge, it's an enemy, it's meant to trick you, it's bad, it's mean. And that's just not a good way to go into a relationship for something that you're trying to get better at. And so something we see frequently is us modeling the attitude of, this is a useful challenge, it's helpful, something that we can get better at, something that's going to help us get better ourselves. And when we see students adopt that attitude and realize that that's a more fruitful way forward, that's actually when they see some of their biggest changes in their scores, because they've removed that friction from the relationship. I'm curious about advice you might have for parents who are watching. How can they bring this into their time with their kids, even if they're not completely overhauling how they talk or how they think? What are some ways in to start using this language in their relationships?
That's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind is the idea that at the end of the day, mindsets are just beliefs. They're powerful, but they're just something in our mind. And we can change our mind. So at the end of the day, it's important to remember that we have a choice. I think it's also important to remember that as human beings, we have a natural kind of tendency towards learning. Right? We're born, I think, with an intense drive to learn. think of it kind of at the earliest stages, infants stretch themselves to walk and talk. They never decide it's too hard or not worth the effort, right? No one says, "Oh, look at that dumb baby, they're trying to walk," right? Right? Babies don't worry about making mistakes or embarrassing themselves. They walk, they fall, they get back up. What puts an end to this drive for learning? I think it's the fixed mindset, right? As soon as children become able to evaluate themselves, some of us become afraid of challenges. So how does this show up for parents, and what advice would I give? I think it's really important to recognize kind of what your own mindset is and kind of the potential impact it has on our loved ones. So recent research suggests that our mindset can actually be traced back to how our parents respond to our struggles, right? When we struggle, how do they respond? Do they respond with panic and concern, and it's immediately something to be covered up or to be healed? Or is it to be something to be responded to with future focus and a kind of a curiosity? Part of the reason, just personally, part of the reason why I'm drawn to this work is because I developed a fixed mindset early in my life. I came from a well-educated family where intelligence was the currency. Imperfections, struggles, they were seen as deficiency, something to be avoided, maybe even ignored. Learning about growth mindsets in graduate school was literally life-changing. So I encourage you to remember not just what your own mindset is, but also remember at the end of the day, we have a choice, right? If we can change our mind, we can change our beliefs.
It's very powerful. Thank you. I'm looking, we're close to time. Sorry, I cut you off.
We are close to time. I do have a question for you. I feel like I've been on the hot seat for a while. And I'm curious just because I know that this is something that you and Bespoke as an organization appreciates. One of the things I admire about Bespoke is that it really prides itself on being a learning organization. As we've talked about fixed and growth mindsets over the years, I'm curious, how is everything we've talked about tonight impact the way in which we look to hire tutors, and in what ways has it impacted how we train or develop our tutors?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, first of all. I'll talk about hiring first. Obviously, and not so obviously perhaps, having a mindset along these lines is really important for a tutor, because almost any situation you go into is a new situation. It's a different family, a different personality of a student that you might be working with. And so tutors have to be flexible and they have to be willing to learn, sometimes on the fly. So one thing we look for in our interviews is we ask our tutors to prepare a small lesson. It's usually a math lesson, just a few minutes, and to do it in a role-played setting in this interview. And then we tell them ahead of time that we're going to pause the lesson at some point and give them a note. And we do that. And it's not a big note. It's not a huge adjustment, or it's not a big criticism of the work that they've done to prepare their lesson. But we do watch very carefully how they respond to that note. And if they don't respond to it or don't incorporate it, or if they bristle at it or take some offense to it, that's something that we weigh very heavily, because it's a small enough thing that a tutor should be able to incorporate it and roll with it. Because some student might someday say, you know, it's not working for me when you do this. Could we try it this other way? And the tutor has got to be able to say, okay, let's try that out. So that is definitely something that we look for in our tutors when we hire them. And then when we're working with students and when we're training tutors, a big thing that this reminds me of is the concept of flow, psychological concept of flow. which is, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the guy's name. He's a Hungarian scientist who worked for the University of Chicago for a long time, but he developed kind of positive psychology, how do brains work when they're working really well. And he tried to break down what is it about challenges that get people happy, that get them excited, that get them really just involved, and so involved that they kind of lose track of time in their work. And he broke down the challenges that they need to reach that state of enjoyment and of growth. And so we help our tutors turn the seemingly impossible challenge of a standardized test when you're first working on it. We help them turn that into a challenge that their students can face. I'll just give you a small example. Right now, a teenager, say a 10th grader, so 16 or 17 years old, they're asked to take a practice test for the SAT, and they sit down to it, and they have to sit in a chair with a 10-minute break, but really in a chair for 3.5 hours, doing nothing else except taking this test. That is a monumental focus that I would argue most adults have no practice in and would be terrible at. So to ask a teenager to do it is really asking them to do the impossible. And it's very hard for them to come out of that and not feel like, oh my God, that's impossible. There's no way that I can do that. So it's the work of a tutor to bring that challenge into the reasonable realm. Let's just start on the math. In fact, let's not even start on the whole math section. Let's just look at these first 10 problems. That's a reasonable challenge. And that's a challenge that a student can actually see some growth on. They can see that improvement. And so by tiering the challenges or leveling them in that way to bring the challenge into the realm of the doable for the student, and then expanding outward from there, we can actually plant the seed for the student that it is doable to make the achievement, to make the gain on this whole test. And so much of the tutor's work is about bringing the growth mindset and that philosophy into work on something that can seem impenetrable or just impossible, how to use the mindset, the attitude of we can do something to build the student's self-perception that they can do it.
That's great.
I'm going to close with one final question, which is just if we are curious, where else should we go? I believe you've got a slide. We can put that up. And I just want to say thank you. If you have any closing remarks, I am going to close with just an entreaty to give us a call. As Sarah said at the beginning, the calls are free. We have lots of good advice and 20 years of experience answering students and families' questions. So we're always glad to engage in those conversations. Ariel, do you have anything to say to close us out?
Yeah, so I've put together on a slide 4 different resources that I think could be worth people's while. The first is an article written by Carol Dweck, the kind of the preeminent researcher on everything we've talked about tonight on cultivating a growth mindset. 2 TED Talks that I think are excellent. Power of Belief, where they really talk about this idea of not yet, and adding the word yet. It can really kind of be literally a life-changing mentality. Carol Dweck with another TED Talk, just introducing mindsets and how they're relevant both in educational spaces and outside. And if you're more of a traditional learner, Carol Dweck wrote a book called Mindset back in 2017, which is excellent. All these resources are definitely worth checking out.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your attention and your presence. And again, if you liked what you saw, please share it widely. We'll send the recordings tomorrow or the next day, and we look forward to including you in the conversation. And Ariel, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I appreciate
Have a
your
good
time
night.
and attention. Bye.